Good afternoon. My name is Russ Feingold, and I am the president of the American Constitution Society, the country's foremost progressive legal organization with more than 200 student and lawyer chapters across the nation. If you don't already, I encourage you to follow us on social media, including on Twitter at ACS Law. You can also find us online at acslaw.org. And there you can join ACS and find more information about upcoming events and opportunities. ACS is celebrating our 20th year of shaping legal debate, nurturing the next generation of lawyers, judges, and advocates, and ensuring that the law is a force to improve the lives of all people. We are focusing our work in this anniversary year on our Constitution's founding failures when it comes to race and equality in this country and reckoning with our past to create a more just future. So because of all that, we could not be more pleased than to be partnering with the LPE Project this year to bring you a series of introductory conversations on law and political economy analysis. This is the fifth such discussion in that series, and we're grateful to Lev Menand, who is an academic fellow and lecturer in law at Columbia Law School, for joining us today to discuss law, money, and banking. We are then going to have a commentary from Yale law professor Amy Kempczynski, who is the faculty co-director of the LPE Project and the co-founder of the LPE blog, and also, of course, Vanderbilt law professor Ganesh Sitaraman, who I'm proud to say is a member of the ACS board and board of academic advisors and the faculty advisor to the ACS student chapter at Vanderbilt Law School. But first, let me turn it over to Amy to say a few words about the LPE Project.
Thanks so much, Russ. It's really great to be here. I'm really looking forward to this event. The Law and Political Economy Project is a network of scholars, practitioners, and students who are working to develop innovative intellectual, pedagogical, and political interventions and to bring back to the center of legal debates the study of political economy and law. And consistent with what you're going to hear from Lev, we're very interested in the interrelationships between politics, the economy, and law, in the notion that these cannot be separated and that law connects in essential ways politics to the economy. And very much also part of our approach and thinking, which is situated in, I would say, a broad scholarly resurgence of interest in political economy, is the notion that some of the dynamics we're living through today, rising inequality, precarity, hollowing out of democracy, and entrenched racial hierarchies and a crisis of care are all deeply intertwined with forms of legal thought that became dominant over the last couple of decades, and that it is important to rethink. So we're delighted to have Lev here with us today to talk to us about some of the ways that political economy themes emerge through the study of banking and money. So Lev, I'm going to turn it over to you. I also put in the chat a few ways that you can connect to our project and sign up for other events and so forth. So thanks so much, Lev.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? All right, and see my slides? I think I just shared my screen. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, Senator Feingold. Thank you to everyone at the LPE network and at ACS for arranging this series and for inviting me to participate. My focus today is going to be on an institutional arrangement I call the American Monetary Settlement, or AMS for short. The AMS is a way to issue money using privately owned, publicly chartered instrumentalities that we know as banks. Congress developed it in the 19th century and fortified it in the 20th century. It's a specific historical configuration. It's distinctive to American political circumstances, and it's come under severe strain in the last 30 to 40 years. In order to understand its character, I think it's critical to first recognize that money is a core tool of economic governance. Part of the reason that the AMS is on life support, in my view, is that we've lost sight of this. And by recovering it, I hope to reveal the stakes in the design of our monetary system and to open up space for thinking about new approaches that are more egalitarian and more democratic. So I've organized my remarks around three questions. First, what is money and banking? Second, how is the US system of money and banking supposed to work? And third, what's gone wrong with the system and what should we do about it? The normative question, how can and should we reform banking, requires clarity about the descriptive question. So before we can discuss what sort of system we want, I think we need to examine what's gone wrong with the system we have, which requires us to appreciate how that system is designed, what the laws on the books say, and why they say it. And this is only possible if we know how banks work, which in turn requires us to understand money. So let's jump in. What is money? This question gets short shrift in the legal literature. Most contemporary scholarship either implicitly or explicitly adopts a neoclassical view. And on the neoclassical view, money is a thing that's out there that market participants agree to use to make trading, commerce more efficient. Think gold or silver or green pieces of paper. Without money, when someone has something like wheat and needs something like iron, they have to find somebody else with iron who also needs wheat. And money came about on this view so that people with wheat can trade for money and then use money to buy iron. And once societies settled on something to serve as a medium of exchange in this way, that thing became a unit of account, a store of value, and a means of settling debts. But notice what's missing from this story. Law, the state, power. By taking these things out, the neoclassical approach naturalizes money, treating it as a market phenomenon through and through. And as a result, it mischaracterizes what money is, where it comes from. It conceals the work that's required to create money, and it obscures a whole lot of things that money does. A better approach to money starts by recognizing that money in the relevant sense is constructed. Money doesn't emerge naturally from commercial exchange. It is issued almost always by states or state-backed legal entities. And the foundation of any money is the monetary unit, the dollar, the euro, the yen. These units, even when their issuers have associated them with physical objects, are essentially accounting entries that can be recorded in a ledger. They have no inherent value. Now, this might seem counterintuitive. After all, anyone can open up a ledger and start, recording entries. Is that all it takes, to make money? No. To be money, people have to accept your ledger entries in exchange for goods and services and tangible and intangible assets. So the market matters here. People use ledger entries only when they expect to be able to transfer them to other people in the future for equivalent value. But the issuer is also really important. The issuer has to make money work. And one way that issuers have done this historically is by taxing and spending in the monetary unit, imposing obligations on a community using force and allowing people to discharge those obligations using ledger entries. Another way to get people to accept monetary units in exchange for actual stuff is to tokenize the units so that people can exchange them with each other without interacting with the issuer. That's what's going on with cash. Each green piece of paper is just a tokenized ledger entry. It even has its own unique identifying number. Tokenizing has a further benefit. It allows an issuer to embed physical collateral like gold and silver. And here you see on the slide, the top two gold coins. Those are the first coins, some of the first coins ever minted. And this collateral, which the neoclassical theory confuses with money itself, backstops the money. It's there if something goes wrong and the issuer, gets conquered by a rival power or goes out of business. It's not money itself. And by aligning the distinction between gold and gold coins, the neoclassical approach misses all the work that goes into creating coins that trade by count, by how many of them you have, instead of by weight, by how much gold. And it also misses how so-called fiat money systems, ones that use pieces of paper, are just like the earlier systems, only without the collateral. So how do fiat money issuers get away with dropping the collateral? It's not easy, especially in a world with competing monies from multiple issuers. It requires institutional structures that limit the amount of money that can be issued so that users won't worry about depreciation. Or you can use force to prohibit competing monies so that users don't have other choices. And these strategies, while we don't have time to get into them, they require a lot of state capacity and pretty advanced legal systems. And the neoclassical view erases all of this. And so by ignoring that money is created and administered, the neoclassical view also overlooks the reasons why states in particular would devote a lot of effort towards making money. So I'm going to talk about 3 of those reasons. The first and most important is to extract resources. So just as buying and selling in money is more efficient than barter, taxing and spending in money is more efficient than taxing and spending in kind. Second, states use money to make the pie bigger. When people value goods and services and assets in money, they create prices. Prices improve the ability of people to make decisions about production and exchange, directing resources more efficiently and more easily. And third, states use money to influence production and distribution. Monetary systems are not something you set up and walk away from. Growing economies need a growing supply of money over time, meaning that money issuers have to constantly put new money into circulation. Directing monetary elasticity toward certain economic activities allows states to govern without relying on coercive power. So what is banking and what does it have to do with money? Let's again start with the neoclassical view. On the neoclassical view, banks are just a type of intermediary. They borrow money from people who have too much of it, and they lend it for a price to people who don't have enough. So if money is gold, they borrow and lend gold. If money is green pieces of paper, they borrow and lend green pieces of paper. Banking is a commercial activity outside of and prior to law and the state. This is the approach to banking you'll get in most contemporary legal scholarship. And this scholarship subsumes banking into the field of financial regulation. It treats banks as just another type of lender, subject to government oversight because they have very short-term unstable funding. And when they collapse, they impose a lot of negative externalities on other market participants. The problem with this approach to banking is that it ignores the defining feature of a bank. Banks do not need existing money, be it coins or paper, to lend, at least not in the first instance. Banks issue their own type of money, an account entry on their books known as a deposit, or a piece of paper known as a banknote, which is really just a certificated deposit. The people banks lend to can use this money to pay other people without state-issued or some other money ever entering into the equation. Now, like some state-issued money, bank money generally embeds collateral, not metal, like a gold coin, but credit, a promise to pay something else on demand, usually some state-issued money. But just as gold coins function as money as long as people trade them by count, bank money functions as money as long as people do not treat it as credit. And they just let that carry along as the collateral. So let me show you a stylized bank balance sheet. When this bank makes a new loan, it does not get more vault cash. It just expands its balance sheet on both sides by increasing the deposit account of the borrower. And bank's ability to do this, it's constrained in many ways, and that we don't have time to get into. And one of them, obviously, is that if the borrower goes out and withdraws cash, then the bank money goes away and the balance sheet shrinks. It didn't work. But just as people don't always melt down their metal coins. People often keep their deposits. So here's just an example, a slide showing the withdrawal, but don't worry, we don't need to get into detail on this. The key intuition is think about your own life. You pay the rent using deposits, you pay your tuition using deposits, you pay your credit card bill using deposits, you receive your salary in deposits. There are over $15 trillion of deposits circulating today, compared to $1.5 trillion of cash, 60% of which circulates overseas. It's not in the United States at all. So most of the money in the US economy, most of the instruments that people use to make payments and store value is created by banks, not by the government. Now let's apply this understanding of banks to US banking law. So it turns out that the neoclassical story is not just missing the fact that banks expand the money supply by issuing notes and deposits, it's missing the fact that banks were expressly set up by the government to do this, and that the government has gone to a whole lot of trouble to make sure that bank money functions like cash. In other words, the system is an outsourcing scheme. Congress set it up to avoid overissue of money, to protect private property, to pacify powerful interests, and to prevent government corruption. The idea for the scheme comes from England, where in the 1690s, under pressure from a growing merchant class, the government agreed to stop expanding the money supply by debasing the coinage. Instead, it pledged to fix the metal content of coins, and it created a corporation owned and controlled by merchants to expand the money supply. That corporation is the Bank of England. So Parliament gave the Bank of England a money monopoly, but required the bank to stay in its lane. It could not engage in commerce. And this shift in the 1690s and in the coming decades, it was no small thing. It marked, in my view, the birth of capitalism, which can be understood, I think, as an institutional system for expanding the money supply that relies on privately owned, publicly backed corporate instrumentalities. Following the American Revolution, the country desperately needed monetary elasticity, and policymakers did not like the idea of the government expanding the money supply directly. So it tried to import the English arrangement. Congress fixed the value of the dollar in metal and chartered the Bank of the United States in 1791, a federal corporation controlled by private shareholders. And Congress granted the BUS a monopoly on note issue at the federal level and prohibited it from engaging in commerce. States set up parallel institutions like the Bank of New York and the Massachusetts Bank, part owned by the states, authorized to expand the money supply in their jurisdictions within limits set informally by the Bank of the United States. But this English system did not take to American soil. There were two problems. Problem number one, the owners and managers of the Bank of the United States looked a lot like an aristocracy. And Americans resented their power and privilege and saw it as incompatible with Republican self-government. Problem number two, these bankers, the people who ran the Bank of the United States, were mostly from the Federalist Party. And it was this partisan entrenchment that proved fatal. So when the Democratic Republican Party came to power in 1800, they started chartering competing banks at the state level, staffed up with their own people. And as the number of these banks grew, resentment of the BUS and its de facto control grew. And in 1828, Americans elected Andrew Jackson to get rid of the bank. And in the 1830s, he did, driving its executives out of power. Over the next 40 years, a new arrangement emerged at the state level that I call the American Monetary Settlement. The legislators who developed the AMS agreed with the founders that the power to expand the money supply was too great to leave in the hands of elected bodies, and that doing so would lead to corruption, stagnation, and a debased currency. But they were also afraid to allow the power to concentrate in the hands of a few unelected executives. So they steered a middle course by diffusing the power and constraining it as much as possible. They set up a system of chartered banks whereby anyone willing and able to comply with certain terms and conditions could create money. And this system has four pillars, and it's basically the system we have today. Delegation, privately owned banks, not the government, expand the money supply. Separation, bankers cannot engage in commerce and vice versa. Open access, anyone is eligible to apply for a charter to expand the money supply as long as they can comply with the terms and conditions. And supervision, special government officials empowered to stamp out unsound banking, ensure that banks fulfill their public purpose. The first two pillars, delegation and separation, they came from England. The second two, those are the new ingredients, and they go together. Diffusing the power to create money into thousands of private hands rather than just a few was a radical idea at the time, and it required a distinct mode of governance, one that is informal, technocratic, and discretionary. And that's supervision. And supervision promised to make bankers more accountable and increase the political legitimacy of banking. So Congress federalized this arrangement during the Civil War. It passed the National Bank Act, which remains the backbone of our financial system today. The act creates a bureau in the Treasury Department called the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. It empowers the comptroller to charter national banks and grants those banks limited powers to expand the money supply, but not to engage in general commerce. It also sets rules for who benefits from monetary elasticity. And under the original rules, the government was the major winner. Banks would have to buy a lot of government bonds. Commercial businesses were also advantaged. Now, this new monetary arrangement, it's important to remember, was actually a compromise. There was an alternative to the AMS on the table, direct money issued by the legislature. And the government was already doing this at the time to pay for the Civil War. It was issuing so-called greenbacks, and I've depicted one here, to pay for the war effort. And many people wanted to stick with this approach, even after the war was over. The NBA was an attempt to avoid this and preserve delegation. Its goal was to bolster confidence in money, avoid government corruption, and satisfy powerful constituencies. And its strategy was to temper delegation with open access and supervision. But ultimately, it was not enough. And this is how central banks fit in. So the term central bank, I put it in scare quotes because it can be a bit misleading. It's used today to describe two distinct institutional arrangements. The first is the sort of central banking pioneered in England in 1694 and tried in the US at the founding. And this type of central banking involves a delegation of public power to private shareholders who enjoy some sort of money monopoly or special position by virtue of their size and relationship to the government. The second sort of central banking is the sense in which people commonly use the term today to describe monetary authorities, government agencies that are specially designed to administer systems of privately owned and operated banks. These central banks are basically super supervisors. They don't do a general banking business with the public. They are like the comptroller, but they have more tools because they issue their own form of money. And this is the system we now have. So the Fed, in my view, was the world's first monetary authority. Congress created it in 1913 when other major countries like the UK, France, Germany, they had no public oversight bodies. The Fed has two main components, a board of governors in Washington and 12 Federal Reserve banks located in different cities around the country. These banks are federal corporations nominally owned by privately owned banks in their districts. 6 of the 9 directors of each Federal Reserve Bank are selected by private banks, but the leadership of the board in Washington is entirely public, nominated by the president, confirmed by the Senate. During the progressive era, Congress designed the Fed to address 3 problems with the privately owned banking system set up during the Civil War. The Fed was really a major progressive innovation. So the first problem it was designed to correct is deflation. As I mentioned earlier, Congress set up privately owned banks to avoid too much money issuance and rising prices. But what it got was periodic bouts of too little money. And the biggest problem was instability. In a system of many competing for-profit banks, people holding money from one bank can withdraw and switch to another at the first sign of trouble. And this can cause the money supply to shrink rapidly, especially if there's no actor in the system willing and able to step in and lend to the bank whose balance sheet is shrinking. In an economy that depends on money to function, monetary contraction can be catastrophic. It leads to defaults, depressions, high levels of unemployment. The second problem, maldistribution. Before the Fed, monetary resources accumulated in the major cities, and parts of the country were often starved for credit. The biggest private banks diverted resources towards speculative activities, lending money to people to buy stocks. When conditions deteriorated, private associations of banks, called clearinghouses, decided which banks survived and which banks failed. And these clearinghouses were controlled by a few big bankers like JP Morgan. The third problem was a yawning legitimacy gap. Traditional bank supervisors were not able to provide the sort of public control over macroeconomic and financial outcomes that progressive reformers, unions, other constituencies demanded. So the Fed is meant to fix these in three ways. So to address deflation, the Fed is supposed to administer bank balance sheets to ensure that they do not contract their issuance, that their money is sound, and that they create enough of it to keep the economy growing at its maximum long-run potential. This is what the Fed's so-called dual mandate is about. Congress added it in 1977 because it was concerned officials were tolerating too much unemployment, but everyone understood maintaining sufficient monetary expansion was the point of the Fed all along. We've lost sight of that a little bit, and we can talk more about that in the Q&A. Second, maldistribution. The Fed operates 12 public utility banks around the country that support the banks in their district without favor or discrimination. They're not allowed to discriminate between them. And the Fed is supposed to also prevent the speculative use of bank credit and to direct monetary elasticity toward productive investments in trade and agriculture. Third, the Fed's supposed to close the legitimacy gap, puts the public in the driver's seat, and serves as a site of public accountability for the system. So in the early years, obviously, the Fed utterly failed, in part because its decision-making process was too weighted towards the private interests that dominated the reserve banks, and in part due to a design flaw in the underlying system. And that flaw was the continued existence of state-chartered money issuers that were not subject to the NBA, didn't join the Fed system. And so state laxity created a race to the bottom with federal authorities. The New Deal Congress passed two major laws to address these problems, the Banking Acts of 1933 and 1935. And these laws create a new agency, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, to federalize the state banking system by providing them with deposit insurance. And this formalized what was always implicit, that bank deposit money was a government product, and it put the government behind that product. Congress also took further steps to direct monetary elasticity. The new regime, for example, disfavored financial speculation, favored home ownership for the first time. And Congress strengthened supervision, giving the government new tools to control bank officers and directors to ensure they operate properly. So the most important of these is the removal power. Congress authorized the Fed to fire bankers for engaging in unsafe or unsound practices. Congress didn't see this as sort of checking private liberty. Supervisors were seen as protecting private liberty by preventing banks from abusing their special privileges. And this hybrid system represented the apex of public control over money in America, and it remains largely on the books today. Congress has never meaningfully rolled back the authority of bank supervisors, even during the procedural revolution of the 1940s. Instead, it's repeatedly reinforced their authority. So before we jump to the ways that practice and the law have diverged, I think it's worth pausing to reflect on some of the problems in the statutory architecture as it exists. So most obviously, there are all of the downsides of sharing public power with private actors. You know, in other infrastructure industries like electricity, the government limits shareholders to a fair return on capital. But neither the New Deal system nor the national banking system was ever so strict with the profits banks generated from money creation. The system has also deeply entrenched existing hierarchies. The reality is that not anyone can get a banking charter. Among other things, you need a lot of capital to start a bank. Most banks have been owned and controlled by white men. And by delegating power to expand the money supply to an unrepresentative segment of the population, an unelected segment of the population, the law gives these people the ability to decide exactly who benefits from monetary elasticity within the framework. So Congress directs bank lending towards business credit or mortgages generally through law, it's the bankers who decide exactly which businesses and exactly which homeowners get bank loans. One of the core features of this system that has since been reversed was a prohibition on banks operating across state lines in multiple locations. And this feature was designed to foster accountability between bankers and the communities they serve. But it also meant that southern states did not have to contend with banks located in the north lending to Black communities in the south. And this was important to southern representatives in Congress who would never have signed off on the federal system otherwise. So it was set up with local control, which meant that even a national monetary system would allow for Jim Crow banking. In 1977, Congress tried to address rampant redlining and racist credit allocation by passing the Community Reinvestment Act, which tasks supervisors with ensuring that banks meet the credit and deposit needs of their entire communities, including low-income and minority groups. But this law is relatively weak and has at best eliminated the worst abuses. Today, delegation continues to mean monetary elasticity in the hands of private bankers, and private bankers continue to be disproportionately white men. So the percentage of Black senior executives in finance generally has decreased in recent years from 2.9% in 2007 to 2.6% in 2018. It was not until 2021 that a woman got the top job at a large US bank. So here is the board of the top bank advocacy group in the country. And a couple of months ago, it was all men. And Jane Fraser was just added, I think, in February. Now, let's take up the problems that are not baked in to our banking laws by design. Our monetary system today is badly malfunctioning along a number of dimensions, and I want to think about what's gone wrong. So, 5 things: shadow banking, universal banking, desupervision, the return of contractionary panics, and the emergence of a monetary financial complex in which the public subsidizes and backstops private risk-taking in financial markets in order to keep the money supply from collapsing. These things are interconnected. Shadow banking prompted universal banking, which led to desupervision, and all 3 of these things led to renewed panics and in turn fed the MFC. So let's start with shadow banking, which is basically the original sin. Shadow banks are firms without US banking charters that expand the money supply by issuing deposit substitutes. Their substitutes come in many shapes and sizes. They're called repos, Eurodollars, commercial paper, money market fund shares, stable coins. And the firms that issue these monies generally cater to the wholesale market. They are broker dealers, mutual funds, hedge funds, and foreign financial institutions. But we're also seeing more and more retail shadow banks like Venmo and Tether. None of these issuers are regulated and supervised like banks. They are not subject to the rules Congress sets for monetary elasticity. They often expand the money supply to finance speculative activities, nor are they separated from commerce. They often engage in financial and non-financial businesses that are off limits to banks. They make a mockery, really, of the banking laws, which pair delegation with separation and supervision and statutory rules governing what sectors of the economy benefit from money creation. But many, and this is the most important part, are either implicitly or explicitly backed by the Fed. And so the deposit substitutes they issue function like money all the same. Now, this shadow system got its start back in the 1950s when broker-dealers began operating like banks and the Fed began treating them like banks, even though it was completely outside of the statutory scheme. Since then, a host of other shadow banks have grown up, including money market funds and foreign banks that lack US bank charters, but issue dollar-denominated deposits nonetheless, called Eurodollars. By 2008, here's a slide, the shadow banks were issuing more money instruments than the banks. Their deposit substitutes were critical components of the money supply. The economy depended on their money to function. And this remains true today. So it shows you in 2013, you see that currency in circulation is a tiny portion of the money supply. That's by design. Insured deposits and uninsured deposits are a substantial portion of the money supply. But there's all these money instruments being issued by shadow banks in here. And if you think about price levels are a function of having this much money. And so if a bunch of it were to collapse, we would have a huge deflationary problem on our hand. The second thing that's happened is that banks have gotten into all sorts of activities that are not statutorily permitted. And this began haltingly in the 1960s when bank regulators responded to the encroachment by shadow banks on their monopoly on money creation by trying to authorize the banks to compete with them in their businesses. So at first, courts restrained the banking agencies from doing this, but eventually, as banks fell on hard time and shadow banking proliferated and expanded, courts just capitulated. And today, although the statutory law is unchanged, banks engage in a wide range of financial and even non-financial activities that Congress never authorized them to conduct. And the intellectual shift I discussed earlier played a big part in this. Supervisors themselves no longer understood their function, and they explicitly embraced what they called a modern conception of banking as funds intermediation, basically private activity, nothing special. And this two-pronged movement, the spread of money augmentation outside of the banking system and the incursion of commercial activity inside it, led supervision to break down. So beginning in the 90s, agencies moved away from substantively overseeing bank risk-taking, and they saw all the complex financial businesses banks were engaging in and decided, government officials aren't going to be able to understand them. Let's have the market do this. At the same time, oversight became harder to justify as the agencies were unable to oversee, for lack of jurisdiction, all this money augmentation by the shadow banks. And these changes damaged the norms that sustain the relationship between banks and supervisors. So banking would no longer seem special or statal. And even as banks continued to produce all the deposits in the economy, the largest banks with their vast legal lobbying and consulting resources, they became more capable of resisting supervisory direction and less vulnerable to agency punishment. When you mix these things together, you get renewed and severe contractionary panics that the central bank is forced to take extreme and extra statutory measures to halt. So you saw this in 2008, which was a breakdown caused by classic runs on shadow bank money. These were runs the Fed and FDIC were meant to eliminate, but their safeguards only applied to banks. The legal framework simply did not contemplate a big shadow system. And to prevent a Great Depression, the Fed was forced to backstop the shadow firms. This meant bespoke bailouts for AIG and Bear Stearns and Citigroup and Bank of America. It also meant hundreds of billions of dollars targeted at broker-dealers and overseas dollar issuers. And when the Fed missed just one shadow money issuer, Lehman Brothers, it triggered a contraction which cost the economy millions of jobs and trillions of lost economic output. And what is often missed is that almost all of this repeated itself last year. First, let me just show you a slide here. This is the run on Lehman Brothers. Almost all of this repeated itself last year, except that this time the Fed did a better job of backstopping shadow banks and kept the financial crisis from dominating news headlines and directly harming our lives. So first, what the Fed did is it rolled out over $1 trillion in shadow bank lending facilities in March of last year. Then it did something unprecedented. It made $2 trillion in market functioning purchases, meaning it bought up so many assets that it healed the left-hand side of shadow bank balance sheets. It stopped the run on these firms by inflating the value of the assets that they held. And today, the result is market participants correctly presume that the Fed is committed to shadow banks as banks, even though shadow banks do not have a statutory franchise for what they're doing and fall outside the regulatory regime that is meant to steer their activities towards public purposes. And in forthcoming work, Morgan Ricks and I call this the monetary financial complex, in which private financial speculation is tied in directly to the monetary system. When the Fed nurtured this system and brought it into existence, it didn't realize, I think, what was going to happen. And today it is held hostage by it. Whenever financial speculators run into trouble, the Fed has to step in to support them. Otherwise, it invites a monetary contraction that will plunge the economy into a deep recession. Now, this complex is a massive transfer of wealth to financial executives and shareholders of shadow banks who benefit from these government subsidies. So basically, the tail is wagging the dog, feeding financialization of the economy and widening inequality. So on one measure, the financial sector grew from 10% of the economy in 1980 to 25% in 2007. And that's the result of uncontrolled money creation fueled by an implicit government backstop. So in my view, the New Deal banking system, which is still on the books, was basically wiped away by private sector actors, public supervisors, and judges. And now we've got a new system that perpetuates inequality, concentrates private power, and leaves us vulnerable to dangerous monetary contractions. And I think the question is, what should we do about it? And there are a variety of ideas out there about how to change the system. And I find that it helps to think about the debate along two dimensions. First, public versus private. Should monetary elasticity be limited to the regulated banking system where it is subject to public direction and control? Or should shadow banks, other parts of the market, be encouraged to compete with banks in expanding the money supply and supported by the central bank when they get into trouble? Second, and here's a 2x2. Second, political versus technocratic. Should laws passed by Congress constrain the Fed and its discretion to administer the banking and shadow banking system? Or should the Fed operate largely unimpeded by statutory restrictions with broad, unreviewable discretion? Now, the New Deal scheme chooses public elasticity under legislative control, and I call this approach democratic structuralism. In the early years, the structuralists, the progressives, battled against monetary libertarians who favored legislative control within the government but private elasticity. They wanted to keep the public role to a minimum. They didn't want discretionary central bankers. They wanted Congress to adopt rule-based monetary policy. The other important viewpoint in the early years, and the one that has come to dominate thinking today, I call the corporatist consensus. So corporatists have populated the Fed's ranks for much of its history, as well as the executive branch and more recently the academy. Corporatists want a money process that operates in almost the opposite way the Federal Reserve Act's drafters intended. They prefer private control of monetary elasticity, with the Fed following the market and backstopping it. And they prefer that the Fed be able to do this to control the public part of the process with politics kept to a minimum. Now, today, a fourth way is emerging that I call technocratic welfarism. Welfarists embrace the spirit of the consensus view, Fed ascendancy within our government, but they seek to turn the Fed toward public ends. They desire public elasticity for public purposes, a central bank subject to few legislative constraints that works in the common interest. They want the Fed to go beyond its current statutory role as a limited purpose monetary authority and use its power over the monetary system to address things like climate change, to remedy deep and long-standing racial inequities, to modulate credit and conduct industrial policy, and to rescue state and local governments from private market discipline. Now, there are two other new approaches that fall outside this 2x2, and these approaches would scrap the basic banking structure entirely. So the first is private money. to replace the dollar with a wholly private money like cryptocurrency issued either by an impersonal algorithm managed by its users like Bitcoin, or a consortium of large multinational corporations like DM, the Libra Project. This is the future envisioned by purist libertarians who want an economy with no state or almost no state interference. It's certainly not construction, and that means no state money. The second alternative is a nascent movement to take back political control over the money supply. It's based on the conviction that the private elements in the monetary system no longer add anything if they ever did. Direct issue, where Congress sets monetary policy by spending money into circulation, would fundamentally reorient the economy away from the market and toward the state. And there are a lot of ways this could be configured. One of them would allow banks and shadow banks to continue operating, but require them to backstop all of their short-term liabilities with government-issued money. This is called full reserve banking or narrow banking. In a full reserve world, banks wouldn't be monetary institutions anymore. They would actually become the simple financial intermediaries that neoclassical theory has treated them as all along. Now, rather than adjudicate between these competing approaches, I thought I might conclude by underlining the value of an LPE approach to these issues. An LPE approach reveals that our monetary system is legally constructed. Everything from the definition of the monetary unit to the system for issuing ledger entries is a matter of law. The US system relies on banks to issue much of the money supply. It also relies on a central bank to coordinate these banks. And that central bank has nurtured a parallel shadow banking system, and our banking agencies have allowed bank activities to expand and bank supervision to atrophy. This institutional architecture has certain distributional consequences. It delegates power to certain actors. It facilitates certain sorts of economic activity. It distributes wealth unevenly and unequally. But there's nothing natural about this system, nor is there anything inevitable about it. The choice to have this system is a political one. Just as our government built these institutions and structured these delegations, it can rebuild them or change them. And my hope is that by better understanding what is at stake in the design of our monetary system, we can have a more fruitful democratic discourse about what comes next. Thank you. And now I will turn things back over to Amy and Ganesh.
Great. Lev, thanks. That was a really spectacularly clear kind of exposition. And I think that there's starting to be some questions in the Q&A, and I wanted to encourage folks to please do put your questions into the Q&A, and we'll be drawing from them. And I think that Ganesh and I are going to ask one or two questions of our own to start us off while we're waiting for a few more questions in the chat. And I guess I wanted to ask you to say a little bit more than you did, if we're able to, in the final parts of your remarks, about the differences between the Foursquare, different approaches to delegation, and then the second slide, non-delegation approaches. To tell us a little bit more about which ones you favor and why, both as between delegation approaches and alternatives to delegation, and the democratic structuralism versus technocratic welfarism. Give us a little bit more sort of an understanding. I particularly, because I know you are interested in sort of see yourself as democratic structuralist. What's democratic about it, and how to talk about that, in a little bit more detail than you were able to. So.
Yeah, that's a terrific question, and I agree that my last couple of slides are question begging. So I do see myself as a democratic structuralist who is also interested in 21st century greenbackism, so public money, which is the second of the two alternative approaches. I prefer democratic structuralism when it comes to maintaining the delegation that is at the core of the AMS, because I think that Congress should decide how to direct monetary elasticity. And so I think there should be a democratic process for deciding, do we want money creation to benefit the state's balance sheet? Do we want money creation to benefit people who are trying to buy a home? And that's something that 21st century legislators repeatedly prioritize, and they put money creation's power towards making that cheaper and easier. Do we want money creation to go towards commercial businesses? Agriculture, there was a big fight over that in the early 20th century. I think those questions should be decided by Congress, not by central bankers. I think those are big, important political questions about distribution that we've lost sight of. We need to recover sight of that, have a new politics about it, and that's something that our representatives should be doing. I don't think that's something that technocrats have a special advantage on. I don't think that there's legitimacy from delegating that authority to them. I think that it's well within the power and right under the Constitution for the Congress to decide that it wants to delegate that to technocrats. I don't have a problem in terms of Congress doing that as a matter of power. I think Congress has the power to design a system how it wants. I just think that it would be better if Congress made those sorts of decisions and had the Fed in a position of implementing those decisions, rather than saying, Fed officials, you'll make the decisions on how to use the monetary system to allocate credit and shape economic activity. To the extent there's a way to modify and increase the public role in the monetary system through some form of direct issue, I think that's interesting and worth examining. I think that it's easier and to recover some of the lost wisdom of the progressive era approach, that should be the first step of an effort to democratize our monetary system.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Lev. Let me throw out a question for you here before we go to the Q&A from the group. And in a way, this I want to try to get you to clarify a little bit just one of the core questions in your presentation, which I think may be on some folks' minds as they're trying to get clear the different paradigms and really understand the AMS as you describe it. So I think for most people, the neoclassical view, seeing a bank as an intermediary, is maybe intuitive. You understand some bit about bartering, and you can sort of imagine a world where you trade, I forgot what your example was, but I think it was wool for steel or something like this. It sounds like your alternative story, the other story, is a story that's actually about the state as a kind of sovereign entity that's involved in money creation, but that in the American context, really, and maybe this is another kind of particularly American thing, really what it involves is outsourcing. That instead of the government deciding we're going to do this work ourselves, the government's decided to outsource this to a bunch of private companies. It's like a contract, or like private contracting with banks. And the banks are just the contractors or the outsourcees. So is that correct as a way to think about it? Should people think about it that way? And the reason why I raise this is it's not the analogy you used, contracting or outsourcing, but I suspect for a number of people, an analogy like that may be a little bit easier than thinking about ledgers and tokenism, which for folks who may not be deep into this area may be a little more challenging.
Completely, it is an outsourcing scheme. I think I said that at one point. The National Bank Act, which is the core statute today, it's an outsourcing scheme. If you look at the legislative debates in Congress, they understood it as an outsourcing scheme. They had an explicit conversation about whether we want to do this thing directly, we want to issue the money supply directly, or whether we want to outsource it. And they decided they wanted to outsource it. And the reason they wanted to outsource it is they thought that It would be fine if the government was able to only, so the idea is, how would the government do it directly? It would pay its own bills by issuing money. And so it would issue money into the system to pay its own bills. And the concern was, well, what if the economy itself needs more money than the government has things to pay for? And then we would have to lend the new money into circulation. And the concern was, we don't want a government bank. That will lead to government corruption. So we want to outsource the function of putting the money supply, of expanding the money supply. That was a major part of the debate during the Civil War period. And so you should think about banks as, yes, they're intermediaries. One of their functions is to intermediate money, but they're a special type of intermediary that also is doing something else. They are expanding the money supply as well. And they are issuing new money into circulation. And that's something that the government has given them the power to do and is explicitly backstopping them to do, because the government doesn't want to do it directly, because the government doesn't want to be in the lending business. Now, the logic of this has shifted dramatically because in the last 150 years, the government's budget has grown enormously. And so it's not so clear anymore that the government couldn't take over more of these functions and monetize its debt, essentially. Yes, your framework as an outsourcing scheme, this is what the banking system is, and it has a lot of features. The legal structure of the banking system has a lot of features of other infrastructural industries that are also outsourcing schemes.
Thanks so much, Lev. So we've got a lot of questions coming in now, and I want to start with one from an anonymous attendee who really asked a question that follows up on both Amy and my questions, and that is, do you think Congress is sufficiently disciplined about the long-term consequences to manage the money supply more responsibly and wisely than the Fed? And I assume from the nature of anonymous attendees' question that this is a sort of skeptical question. You know, can Congress really do this work? Because you've said that you think there should be a little bit more legislative control. So how do you respond to skeptics that Congress may not have the right incentives to do the long-term kind of wise and responsible planning that may be necessary for setting policy?
So in my view, that is a strong argument for being in the democratic structuralist box as opposed to the democratic, the public money alternative. In other words, that's the traditional argument for the Federal Reserve System that Woodrow Wilson and FDR thought was critical. They didn't want the Federal Reserve deciding who would benefit from monetary elasticity, but they did want the Federal Reserve deciding when there needed to be more money and when there needed to be less money, because they were concerned on that question, Congress might make mistakes. And the classic concern is over-issue money because juicing the economy, it will give you short-term political benefits, and that Congress might fall sway to that. Whereas if you have insulated technocrats, they're going to be less likely to have that same incentive structure, and therefore you're more likely to get a credible money supply that doesn't lead to an inflationary spiral. And so I'm sympathetic to that being something that needs to be considered in the design of the monetary system, but I don't think that concern extends to questions about who should be benefiting from expansions in the money supply, questions that the Fed has been implicitly and explicitly answering, often in contravention of the statutory framework, by directing monetary elasticity towards the financial system, towards financial speculation. And I think that we need to recover a traditional monetary politics, and that Congress is suited for debating and passing laws about who should benefit from monetary expansion. And I think that congressional policy is likely to be more egalitarian, more democratic than the technocratic policy that has dominated in the past 30 to 40 years. On all of this stuff, Congress's competence is a function of the strength of the political discourse in the country more generally. And so it's hard to envision a Congress that is active on monetary issues because monetary politics has become so deadened in the last 50 years. But if you go back and you read the congressional record from the 19th century and from the early 20th century, Congress was more expert on monetary and banking issues than almost anybody in the academy is today, or even in the financial system is today. They had a remarkably sophisticated understanding of money and banking issues. And there was real monetary and banking activism that drove political movements throughout the 19th century. And it was those movements and that discourse that supported the ability for a democratic representative institution like Congress to play a major role here. Without any of that, it's hard to imagine Congress playing a major role here. And so that has to be corrected. And so part of what I'm trying to do is it's a multi-step thing. You can't change institutional structure overnight. Things have to be changed in phases, and understanding and being aware of how this works and why it matters is a first step towards any type of reconfiguration. If you try to reconfigure without doing that stuff, you will get bad outcomes.
So I guess if I'm understanding you correctly, is part of the thinking that the democratic structuralist piece, the sort of Congress reanimating an interest in how credit is allocated effectively, becomes step one towards something that could become more congressional involvement also in direct creation of the money supply?
Yeah, what I'm saying is I'm not convinced that it's impossible to have a successful politics of monetary policy that isn't an inflationary disaster. Mm-hmm. I think the concerns are real, but I think that we're a ways off from being able to do it correctly. Certainly, but what we can do in the interim is try to recover some of the statutory structure that we already had that worked very well it brought us some of our most prosperous decades, that doesn't involve fully congressional monetary policy, that does involve central bank technocrats. It gives them a limited remit, and it has a larger remit for Congress that actually does serious lawmaking in this space. And for the 20th century, this was the case. And so it's really, there's a lot of empirical evidence that suggests we can, at the very least, recover that.
So I wanted to pull another question in from the chat, which was about the relationship between LPE and modern monetary theory. I think you're standing in for the LPE view of money here. So I guess I'll ask you what your thinking is about how what you've described today relates to MMT, since they both, as Jess points out, appear to rely on the state as an issuer and creator of money. How does your thinking interact with MMT, and particularly if you could speak to the question of inflation?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So I think MMT is a hugely important intervention in debates about public finance and the monetary system that has exposed major flaws in conventional thinking about public finance and about money. What I would say that is different from MIT, what I would add to MMT is a political economy view to an economic theory. And so Stephanie Kelton, in her book, The Deficit Myth, which everyone should read, explains in economic terms how the government, because it is a money issuer, can, in a static sense, always finance its operations because it can issue money. It's not going to default. But because she's an economist and approaching this issue from an economic standpoint, there's a political economy aspect that's missing that I think is worth also considering. So one of the things that she points out is that, you know, the US government is not a currency user the way they're treated in current public finance debate. They're a currency issuer. But the thing is, that's true, except that it's a policy choice to make the federal government a currency user. And so we have chosen to make the federal government a currency user and to force it to borrow for political economy reasons, because both because we want to impose a certain sort of discipline. This goes all the way back to Alexander Hamilton, who thought that if the government issued the money supply directly, it wouldn't levy taxes, which are harder to do. And it thought the government should be constrained by having to levy taxes to finance itself. And he's explicit about this. He has a political economy argument for it. But there's also a monetary system design question. You need to create a monetary system that people have confidence in. And in a world with alternative monies, states' sovereignty is constrained. And so even the United States sovereignty faces some constraints in terms of its ability to remove the various institutional structures that it has created to generate a sense of confidence in the US dollar and the stability of the US dollar. And it is possible for a state to pursue its public finances in a way that causes the market to lose confidence in the future value of the currency. And as I mentioned earlier, the neoclassical view treats currency as all market, but I think it's also a mistake to treat it as all state. There is a market component to currency, and if you look at currency systems around the world, people have to voluntarily want to hold the currency for the currency to work. And so if there's a run on a currency, you have a problem. And so MMT has a theory about how as long as the government doesn't try to overspend as measured by generated inflation, things will be fine. And that's totally correct. It's a theoretical matter. There's a political economy question about the extent to which the government pursuing its public finances in that way will run the risk of losing the confidence of market participants, and people may, in the dynamics over time, because of mistakes that might be made, decide that they would rather hold some other currency as a store of value. And so I think that the thing that I would add to the MMT theory is we need to think about the larger institutional dynamics and all the work that the state is doing to maintain the confidence of its currency over time, and the fact that being government treating itself as a currency user is a policy choice that I think is bad in a lot of respects, but there are benefits to it, and it's important to take those into account when we're thinking about altering how the system works.
So another contemporary question for you, Lev. So we have another questioner who asks, you've argued that the CARES Act liquidity provisions amended the Fed's emergency authorities sub silentio. Would you elaborate on that? Are there other statutes that have altered the Fed's statutory authorities in similarly subtle ways? And I'll maybe expand a little bit on the question, because I know you've done a fair bit of thinking and some writing on this, but how do you think about the Fed's actions in the spring of last year? I mean, you talked a little bit about it in your talk, but maybe you can just elaborate a little bit more on how we should interpret what the Fed was doing in the context of the approach and the structural framework that we have that you've described as the American monetary settlement.
Yeah, so this is a question that I'm very interested in and that I'm still thinking about, and I'm interested in others' views. Feel free to email me afterwards. So I've written about the Fed's 16, by my count, there's basically 16 ad hoc facilities that the Fed set up in March to prevent, a truly a truly terrifying economic outcome as a result of a full-on panic in the shadow banking system. And some of those facilities were also geared towards lending into the real economy. For a group of those facilities, Congress appropriated money for the Treasury Secretary to invest in them in the CARES Act, which was passed on March 27th of last year. And the way the CARES Act is worded, it sort of assumes that the Federal Reserve would have the authority to do the lending that the act is talking about. So it talks about the Fed setting up facilities just like it does for shadow banks. It says, so the Fed, here's money for the Treasury Secretary to invest in facilities the Fed could set up for businesses, medium-sized and small businesses, and corporations and municipalities, state and local governments. And the act assumes in doing this that the Fed can do that. And it's actually in tension with a bunch of amendments that Congress made to the Federal Reserve Act in 2010 as part of Dodd-Frank, where it restricted, after the 2008 crisis, the Fed's ability to lend to non-banks. And one of the restrictions that it put in place is it said that Fed lending to non-banks has to be for the purpose of providing liquidity to the financial system. And lending to municipalities or lending to small businesses isn't for the purpose of providing liquidity to the financial system, especially longer term 4 or 5 years loans. That's extending credit to businesses and municipalities, which is sort of the opposite of supporting funding liquidity of dealer firms, which is what Congress likely had in mind coming out of the 2008 crisis. And so what I've argued is that we shouldn't view the Fed's Main Street lending facilities and municipal program as illegal just because it's sort of inconsistent with this and a couple of other provisions from the 2010 amendments. We should read the CARES Act as amending the Federal Reserve Act sub silentio. It's the more recent and more specific statute, and it specifically contemplates this sort of lending. But I criticize Congress a little bit because I think that we would benefit from a more clear statutory framework for what sort of non-bank lending the Fed is authorized to do and what sort of non-bank lending it isn't authorized to do. And this really, the way that the CARES Act is worded just muddies the waters and leaves a lot of uncertainty going forward as to what the Fed's authority is and what types of lending it can and can't do. What the CARES Act does not address, and that I think is also unfortunate and Congress should address at some point, is all of the Fed's lending to non-banks, which a lot of which it structures outside of its non-bank lending authorities as purchase and sale agreements, using its buying and selling authority. And I view that as contrary to the statute, and I explain at length in this paper why I think that is the case. That dates way back. And when the Feds first started doing it in the 1950s, it was really controversial. Wright Patman in Congress reamed the Fed chair, William McChesney Martin, for it and challenged him. And Martin said, if we don't have the authority, really, you should add it. And Congress never did. And the Fed continued to do this sort of lending. And this goes to just the larger shadow banking problem, which Congress has not faced head on squarely and has danced around the issue repeatedly. And during a pandemic is not the right time to address, I think, that sort of issue. But the 2020 experience suggests that more attention is needed to the Fed's authorities there and what sort of relationship Congress expects the Fed to have with the shadow banking system.
We are almost at 5:15. I know there's a number of other really excellent questions in the Q&A, but maybe you'd be willing to follow up with people separately somehow. I think we do have to wrap it up. I think, Russ, you wanted to come back on and say a few words. And thanks so much from all of us for a terrific discussion.
Thank you, Amy, and I will be extremely brief. Lev, thank you for an outstanding and really stimulating presentation. And of course, Amy and Ganesh for your making sure we had this excellent series of programs already. I haven't missed any of them. I feel like it would have been great if my 1L year had been more of this and maybe less of some other things. So thank you so much, and we look forward to working on this together in the future. Just a reminder, of course, our national convention, which will be virtual, will be June 7th through the 11th, where you will hear more of this sort of thing and also many other critical topics. Thanks, and have a wonderful weekend, everybody.
Thank you.